Everything you've been taught about the socialism debate is wrong. I don't mean your position is wrong. I mean the entire conversation is happening on the wrong playing field. Socialists argue their system will be more fair. Capitalists argue free markets are more efficient. And both sides go back and forth forever, trading studies and statistics and moral claims. But here's what nobody told you. There's an Austrian economist named Ludwig von Mises who ended this debate in 1922, not with better statistics, not with moral arguments, with pure, devastating logic that makes socialism not just undesirable, but logically, mathematically impossible. You know what's crazy? You've probably never heard these arguments. Not in school, not in political debates, nowhere. Because if people knew what Mises proved, the entire socialism discussion would collapse overnight. Think about your last argument with someone who wants free healthcare, student loan forgiveness, universal basic income. You probably said something about government inefficiency or national debt. They probably called you heartless. And the argument went nowhere, right? That's because you were playing on their field, debating whether socialism would be better. But Mises doesn't play that game. He proves it can't work. Period. Not it would work badly. Not it has problems. It's structurally, fundamentally, irreversibly impossible for reasons that have nothing to do with corruption or implementation. Imagine having three conceptual weapons so sharp that every socialism debate becomes a 30-second conversation. Someone proposes government-run anything. You deploy one of these concepts and the discussion is over. Not because you won an argument, because you revealed there was never anything to argue about. That's what I felt when I first understood these three Mises concepts. Like I've been arguing about whether Superman could beat Batman, while someone was holding the script showing they're both fictional characters. You're not alone in never learning this. The entire academic political complex has a vested interest in keeping these arguments buried, because Mises doesn't just critique socialism, he annihilates the intellectual foundation every government intervention rests on. I know exactly how you feel. You watch socialism gaining ground, especially among young people, and you feel frustrated because your objections sound weak even to yourself. Government waste feels like a practical complaint, not a principled stand. Free markets work better sounds like an opinion, not a fact. You deserve better ammunition than that. In the next 10 minutes, I'm going to give you the three concepts Ludwig von Mises used to destroy socialism's intellectual credibility. Not weaken it, not criticize it, destroy it. These aren't political talking points. They're logical proofs as certain as mathematics. By the end, you'll never feel outgunned in these debates again. Because Mises did something remarkable. He showed that socialism isn't even wrong about economics. It's tried to do something that violates the laws of human action itself. If you want to discover more thinkers like Mises who give you clarity when everyone else offers confusion, subscribe to this channel where we explore the ideas that actually explain reality. Let me start with something that sounds simple but changes everything. Only individuals act. That's it. That's Mises's first concept, methodological individualism. And your first reaction is probably, well, obviously. But stay with me, because this obvious truth destroys half of political discourse. When someone says America needs to compete with China, who exactly is competing? Not America. That's just a word for 330 million individuals. When someone says the government should invest in green energy, who is the government? It's thousands of individual bureaucrats, each with their own interests, knowledge, and motivations. Here's why this matters. Socialists treat society like a thinking, acting entity with goals and preferences. They say things like society should prioritize healthcare over military spending. But Mises forces the question, which specific individuals get to decide what society prioritizes? And by what mechanism do those individuals' preferences become everyone else's obligations? Notice what just happened. You can't answer those questions without admitting that society deciding actually means some individuals forcing other individuals. There's no collective brain making collective decisions. They're only individual bureaucrats making individual choices and enforcing them on everyone else. Think about your local school board. When they decide to implement a new curriculum, that's not some mystical entity called the community acting. It's Karen, Bob, and Steve voting based on their personal beliefs, political pressures, and what their activist friends want. Then that decision gets forced on thousands of families who had zero input. Mises saw this everywhere in 1920s Vienna. Intellectuals kept talking about what Austria needs, or what the working class demands. And he'd interrupt. Which Austrians? Which workers? With what specific preferences? And why do their preferences override mine? This is Mises' ruthless precision at work. He doesn't let you hide behind collective nouns. Every time someone proposes government action, methodological individualism forces you to ask, which specific individuals will make this decision? With what knowledge? Facing what incentives? And who give them authority to override everyone else's choices? You know what's beautiful about this? It's not debatable. Try to argue against it. Go ahead. No, collectives really do act as unified entities. You can't, because when you say, the collective decided, you're actually describing a process where individuals voted or a leader commanded or a committee compromised. There's no escaping the fact that all action is individual action. Here's where it gets devastating for socialism. If only individuals act, then phrases like social justice or the common good are meaningless unless you specify which individuals get to define them. And the moment you specify that, you've admitted socialism is just some people's preferences being forced on everyone else. There's no collective will being expressed. There's only individual wills in conflict, with government power determining which individuals win. Let me show you how this works in real life. Student loan forgiveness sounds like society helping young people, but methodological individualism reveals it's actually Sheila who paid off her loans, being forced to pay for Brandon's degree in philosophy. That's not society acting. That's individual A being robbed to benefit individual B, with individual bureaucrat C, D, and E making a decision. Wait till you see how Mises builds on this foundation. Now Mises takes methodological individualism and asks, okay, if only individuals act, what can we know for certain about individual action? His answer is a second concept, Praxeology, the logic of human action. And it starts with one axiom so undeniable you literally can't argue against it without proving it true. Humans act purposefully to achieve chosen ends. Think about that. Right now, you're watching this video. That's an action. You chose to click, to keep watching, to listen. You're trying to achieve something, maybe learn, maybe confirm beliefs, maybe find ammunition for debates. You're acting on purpose with a goal. You cannot deny this without performing it. If you say, I don't act purposefully, you just acted purposefully. You chose words, formulated an argument, tried to achieve the goal of contradicting me. The axiom is self-evident and undeniable. From this one axiom, Mises deduces the entire structure of economics. Because if humans act purposefully, several things must be true. 1. We face scarcity. If you could have everything instantly, you wouldn't need to act. Action is only necessary because we can't have it all simultaneously. 2. We have preferences. You chose this video over infinite alternatives. That reveals you prefer learning about Mises to watching cat videos right now. 3. Action takes time. You can't watch this video and simultaneously mow your lawn. Choices have opportunity costs. 4. We evaluate means based on ends. You're using 10 minutes of your time as means to gain knowledge as an end. You judge this means effective for that end. Notice what Mises just did. Without any statistics, surveys, or historical data, he derived fundamental economic laws from pure logic. Scarcity, preference, opportunity cost, means ends reasoning. All of it flows necessarily from the undeniable fact that humans act purposefully. This is why Mises called economics a priori, meaning before experience. Economic laws aren't discovered through observation like physics. They're logically deduced from the nature of action itself. You know what this means? It means economic laws are as certain as mathematics. If humans act, then scarcity exists, period. No amount of technology or policy can eliminate it. If humans act, then opportunity costs exist. Every choice means unchosen alternatives. This isn't debatable. Here's where it annihilates socialism. Socialists constantly propose policies that violate these logical necessities. Free college. Okay, but if action requires means, and means are scarce, who provides the professors buildings and books? Someone's labor is being used. That's not free. That's forced redistribution. Living wage. Okay, but if employers face scarcity and labor is a means to their ends, artificially raising its price makes them labor unprofitable to employ. Unemployment isn't a policy choice. It's a logical necessity when price floors exceed productivity. I thought at first this was Mises being clever with words. Then I realized he's doing something more profound. He's showing that certain economic consequences aren't empirical questions. They're logical certainties that flow from the nature of action itself. Imagine trying to argue, no, we can eliminate opportunity costs through better policy. You can't, because the moment you choose policy A over policy B, you've created an opportunity cost. The moment you allocate resources to Project X, you made them unavailable for Project Y. This isn't about efficiency or corruption. It's about the logical structure of reality. Minimum wage sounds compassionate until Praxeology reveals. If labor costs more than it produces, employing it causes losses. So rational actors stop employing it. That's not an opinion. It's a logical deduction from purposeful action. Mises used to drive socialists crazy with this. They present mountains of data, and he'd respond, "Your data is irrelevant. You're proposing logical impossibilities." They thought he was arrogant. He was just being precise. Here comes the really interesting part. Mises takes these two concepts, methodological individualism and praxeology, and combines them into a weapon that destroys socialism's entire foundation. This is the big one. The concept that ended the intellectual debate forever. The economic calculation problem. In 1920, socialists were riding high. The Soviet Union was the future. Capitalism was dying. Intellectuals everywhere embraced central planning. And Mises published an essay that proved, not argued, proved, that socialist economies cannot rationally allocate resources. Here's the setup. Remember methodological individualism? Only individuals have preferences. And praxeology? Action requires choosing among scarce means to achieve ends. Now Mises asks, how does an economy figure out what to produce, how much, and for whom? In a market economy, prices do this automatically. You want a sandwich. You're willing to pay $8. Deli owner calculates he can make it for $5. Transaction happens. Price signals $8 for sandwich, $3 for bread, $50 per hour for labor. Coordinate millions of these decisions without anyone being in charge. But prices aren't arbitrary numbers. They're information signals emerging from millions of individuals expressing preferences through voluntary exchange. When you pay $8 for that sandwich, you're revealing, I prefer this sandwich to $8 worth of other things. When deli owner charges $8, he's signaling, given my costs and alternatives, $8 makes this worth my while. Now here's Mises' devastating question. In a socialist economy with no private property and no market exchange, where do prices come from? Let me be specific. Suppose you're the central planner for the United States. You need to decide, should we build more hospitals or more schools? How many? Where? Using what materials? Employing which workers? In a market, prices answer this automatically. Hospital construction costs X million, school construction costs Y million, and thousands of individuals spending their own money reveal which they value more. Contractors bid on projects. Workers choose where to work. Materials flow to highest bidders. No one decides the answer. The answer emerges from millions of individual decisions. But you're the central planner. You abolish private property and markets. So you have no prices, no beats, no profit loss signals. You're supposed to calculate whether steel should go to hospitals or schools, but you have no way to calculate. You don't know what people actually prefer because they're not spending their money. You're spending theirs. You don't know actual costs because there's no market determining opportunity costs. You're flying blind. Mises showed this isn't a practical problem. Like, planning is hard. It's a logical impossibility. Economic calculation requires market prices, and market prices require private property and voluntary exchange. Without them, you literally cannot determine if you're using resources rationally or wasting them catastrophically. Think about Soviet Russia. They planned the economy for 70 years, and they had no idea if they were succeeding. Sure, they produced tons of steel, but was that the right amount? Should it have been more? Less? Should those resources have gone to consumer goods instead? They couldn't know because they had no price signals telling them what people actually valued versus what politicians claimed they needed. This is why every socialist economy has massive shortages and surpluses simultaneously. Tons of unwanted tractors, zero toilet paper. Because without prices, planners are guessing. And guesses based on political preferences, not economic calculation. You know what kills me? Mises published this in 1920. For over 100 years, we've watched every socialist experiment confirm his prediction. Venezuela right now, price controls creating shortages. Cuba, ration cards for basic goods. Even China had to reintroduce markets to function. And still, intellectuals propose central planning like the economic calculation problem doesn't exist. If this revelation is hitting you as hard as it hit me, hit like so more people discover why socialism isn't just bad policy, it's logical impossibility. Here's the kicker that connects all three concepts. Methodological individualism establishes that only individuals have preferences. Praxeology establishes that rational action requires comparing costs and benefits. Economic calculation proves that without market prices, you cannot make those comparisons. Conclusion: socialism cannot rationally allocate resources because it lacks the mechanism, prices. That makes calculation possible, not difficult. Impossible. Now, let's bring this home to your actual life, because these three concepts don't just destroy theoretical socialism. They annihilate the intellectual foundation of every government program you're told to support. Student loan forgiveness? Let's run it through the three concepts. Methodological individualism asks, who is actually being forgiven and who is actually paying? Not society. Specific individuals who borrowed, specific individuals who are taxed or inflated upon. The collective language, helping students, hides forced wealth transfer between individuals. Praxeology reveals, if you remove consequences of borrowing by forgiving loans, you change incentives for future action. Rational actors will borrow more, expecting future forgiveness. This isn't cynicism. It's logical deduction from purposeful action. People respond to incentives. Economic calculation exposes. When government subsidizes college through loans, universities can't receive price signals about real demand. If students paid directly, expensive low-value degrees would price themselves out, natural market correction. But government loans prevent that calculation, creating bubble of worthless degrees at inflated prices. All three concepts, all pointing to the same conclusion. This policy violates basic logical principles. Or take affordable housing mandates. Notice how these three concepts tear it apart. Methodological individualism. The city doesn't need affordable housing. Specific individuals want cheaper rent. Developers aren't greedy. They're individual humans responding to costs and opportunities. The policy is individual politicians forcing individual property owners to charge less than market value to benefit individual renters. Praxeology. If you force rents below what makes building profitable, rational actors build less. If you can make 10% return on office buildings, but only 3% on rent-controlled apartments, you build offices. Shortage isn't failure policy. It's a logical consequence of policy. Economic calculation. Rent control destroys price signals. Prices normally signal build more here when demand exceeds supply. But if government caps prices, that signal is jammed. Developers can't calculate whether building makes sense. Result, permanent shortage. Exactly as Mises predicted. I could do this all day. Every single government intervention fails the Mises test. Infrastructure spending? Without market prices, planners cannot calculate whether this bridge creates more value than alternative uses of resources. They're guessing based on politics, not economics. Industrial policy? Government, investing in green energy, lacks the profit-loss test that reveals whether resources are well used. Cylinder bankruptcy proves central planners can't calculate like markets can. Minimum wage raises price of labor above some workers' productivity, making employing them cause losses, so rational actors don't employ them. Unemployment is logical necessity. You see the pattern? Once you understand these three concepts, you develop X-ray vision for policy proposals. You instantly see the calculation problem, the collectivist language hiding individual coercion, the violations of praxeological laws. And here's what's liberating. You don't need to be an economics PhD to deploy these. They're simple logical tools. Someone proposes government program, ask which specific individuals decide and which are coerced. That's methodological individualism. Ask, what incentives does this create for purposeful actors? That's praxeology. Ask, how do decision makers calculate whether this creates value without market prices? That's economic calculation. 99% of policy proposals collapse under these three questions. I started doing this in conversations, and it's remarkable how quickly debates end. Someone proposes universal basic income. I ask, if giving people money without work makes them better off, why stop at $1,000 per month? Why not $10,000? They sense the trap. I continue, because you intuitively know printing money doesn't create wealth. It just changes prices. You can't violate scarcity through monetary policy. That's praxeology forcing them to confront logical reality. These concepts are like martial arts for intellectual combat. You don't need to be stronger. You need to know where the pressure points are. Mises found them. Here's the question that should bother you. If these three concepts are so devastating, why doesn't everybody know them? Why didn't you learn about the economic calculation problem in high school economics? Why do university professors teach Marx but not Mises? Why do political debates never mention praxeology? The answer tells you everything about how intellectual power really works. Mises lived through the answer. In the 1920s, he published the economic calculation problem and expected serious engagement. Instead, he got silence, then dismissal, then personal attacks. Socialist economists tried to refute him. Oscar Lange proposed market socialism, with a central planner just pretending to use prices. Mises showed this was incoherent. You can't have market prices without private property and real exchange. But academia ignored him and declared Lange the winner. Why? Because Mises threatened every intellectual and politician whose career depends on government intervention. Think about it. If these three concepts are correct, and they are, then every economics professor teaching Keynesianism is wrong. Every politician promising government solutions is selling impossibilities. Every bureaucrat planning the economy is engaged in intellectual fraud. The entire apparatus of the modern state rests on violating Mises's logical proofs. Of course they bury him. Accepting Mises means admitting their life's work is built on sand. But here's the beautiful part. Truth doesn't need institutions. It just needs people willing to think clearly. And that's you. You just learned in 10 minutes what academia spends for years making sure you don't learn. You now possess intellectual weapons that make you immune to manipulation. When politicians promise investment in infrastructure, you know they mean forced redistribution decided by individuals who can't calculate value without market prices. When activists demand economic justice, you know they mean some individuals' preferences enforced on others through state violence. The words change. The logic doesn't. And this is why Mises matters more today than ever. We're living through the biggest expansion of government power since the New Deal. Every crisis, pandemic, inflation, climate inequality, gets solved with more intervention. And nobody asks the Mises questions. Infrastructure bill? Did anyone calculate whether $1.2 trillion in government spending creates more value than leaving that money in private hands? Of course not, because they can't. They lack the market prices that enable calculation. Student loan forgiveness? Did anyone ask what incentives this creates for future borrowers in universities? Of course not, because Praxeology reveals uncomfortable truths. Green energy subsidies? Did anyone ask which individuals' preferences determine what counts as green and who pays for it? Of course not, because methodological individualism exposes the coercion. You see what just happened? You now think differently about policy than 99% of people. Not because you're smarter, because you have better tools. Mises gave you a framework that cuts through rhetoric and reveals reality. I think about Mises in his final years, watching Keynesianism dominate universities, socialism spread globally, everything he warned against coming true, yet nobody listening. He must have felt so alone. But he was right, and history proved it. Every socialist economy collapsed or converted to markets, exactly as economic calculation problem predicted. Every interventionist policy created the opposite of its stated goal, exactly as Praxeology predicted. Every collective promise turned into individual coercion, exactly as methodological individualism predicted. Mises was right, and now you know why. The question is, what do you do with this knowledge? You could keep it to yourself. Stay silent when someone proposes the next government solution, the next free program, the next central plan. Or you could be like Mises, willing to stand alone, armed with nothing but logic, refusing to accept comfortable lies. Here's what I know. Once you see through collectivist language with methodological individualism, once you understand action through praxeology, once you grasp why calculation requires prices, you can't unsee it. Every news story, every policy debate, every political promise reveals itself as either ignorance or deception. That's uncomfortable. It's also liberating, because you're not fooled anymore. 10 minutes ago, you thought socialism was a debate about values, their compassion versus your pragmatism, their fairness versus your freedom. You probably felt outgunned because moral arguments are hard to win. Now you see it differently. Socialism isn't a moral debate. It's a logical impossibility trying to dress itself in ethical language. Methodological individualism revealed that every collective promise is individual coercion in disguise. When someone says society should provide health care, you now hear, individual bureaucrats should force individual taxpayers to fund individual patients' care. The collective language was always misdirection. Praxeology showed that economic laws flow from the undeniable fact that humans act purposefully. This means consequences like minimum wage causes unemployment and price controls create shortages aren't opinions or empirical findings. They're logical certainties. You can't debate them any more than you can debate 2 + 2 is equal to 4. Economic calculation problem proved that without market prices emerging from private property and voluntary exchange, rational resource allocation is impossible, not difficult, not suboptimal, impossible. Every socialist economy that ever existed confirmed this. They all either collapsed, converted to markets, or survived through black markets that provided the prices central planning couldn't. These three concepts don't make you better at arguing for capitalism. They reveal there was never anything to argue about. Mises didn't win a debate. He showed the debate was based on false premises. That's the transformation. You're not entering conversations about socialism anymore as defender of capitalism. You're entering as person who understands reality, patiently explaining to well-meaning people why they're proposing logical impossibilities. It's like someone arguing that triangles should have 4 sides. You don't debate whether four-sided triangles would be superior to three-sided ones. You explain that triangle means three sides definitionally, and what they're proposing isn't even coherent enough to evaluate. That's socialism after Mises. It's not a political position worth debating. It's a category error addressed as policy, and you'll never see it the same way again. Starting today, when someone proposes any government intervention, doesn't matter if it's bipartisan infrastructure or progressive wealth tax. You have a simple three-question framework. First, which specific individuals make this decision and which specific individuals are forced to comply? Strip away collective nouns. Make the coercion visible. Build more houses becomes politicians forcing builders to construct below-profit housing at taxpayer expense. Suddenly, it's not so appealing. Second, what incentives does this create for people acting purposefully to improve their situations? If you subsidize college, people borrow more for useless degrees. If you forgive loans, people expect future forgiveness. If you control prices, suppliers exit the market. This isn't cynicism, it's praxeology. People respond to incentives. Third, without market prices, how do decision makers calculate whether this creates value? This is a killer. Government has no profit loss test, no price signals, no skin in the game. They're guessing, and guessing with your money. Practice this framework on tomorrow's news. Infrastructure spending? Run the three questions. Student loan policy? 3 questions. Climate subsidies? 3 questions. You'll notice something remarkable. 99% of policy proposals fail all 3 tests immediately. They hide individual coercion behind collective language, ignore obvious incentive problems, and pretend calculation is possible without prices. But 1% pass the tests, usually proposals to remove existing interventions. End occupational licensing passes. It removes individual bureaucrats' power to prevent individual workers from pursuing livelihoods. Eliminate tariffs passes. It stops forcing individual consumers to subsidize individual domestic producers. The framework doesn't just destroy bad ideas. It reveals good ones. And that's Mises' real gift. Not just showing what doesn't work, but clarifying what does. There's a line from Mises I can't forget. In Human Action, he wrote, "Economics must not be relegated to classrooms and statistical offices, and must not be left to esoteric circles. It is a philosophy of human life and action, and concerns everybody and everything. It is the pith of civilization and of man's human existence." Do you feel the weight of that truth? Economics is an academic abstraction. It's the logic of how humans cooperate in conflict, prosper and suffer, build and destroy. And you just learned the core of it in 10 minutes. Imagine your life 6 months from now. You're not perfect. Mises never promised perfection, but you're clear. When politicians promise solutions, you see the calculation problem. When activists demand justice, you see the methodological individualism they're violating. When economists cite studies, you know their data can't override praxeological laws. You're not convinced by rhetoric anymore, because you understand the logic underneath. And when you face the inevitable, watching bad policy implemented despite obvious flaws, seeing socialism gain ground despite proven failures, you'll remember Mises standing alone in 1920s Vienna, surrounded by intellectuals embracing the very ideologies destroying Europe, armed with nothing but logic, refusing to concede what he knew to be true. If he could do that in the face of Nazism and Stalinism, you can do it facing whatever comes. This channel exists to discover together the thinkers like Mises who refused to compromise truth for popularity, who built frameworks that outlast fashions, who gave us weapons against intellectual tyranny. Subscribe if you want to continue this journey. In the next video, we'll discover how Thomas Sowell applies these principles to the policies destroying American cities right now. See you there. And meanwhile, may reality set you free.